Michael Moir, sitting next to Michael Ridley, is the University Archivist and head of the Clara Thomas Archives and Special Collections at York University. He began as an archivist with St. Christopher's House, and he has worked as records manager and archivist for the Toronto Harbour Commission, then Manager of Archival Services by the for the Municipality of Metropolitan Toronto. And post-amalgamation, he became City Archivist for the new City of Toronto. He has been at York University Libraries since 2004, and he is, of course, also familiar with us, having been an adjunct instructor here. And on my immediate...
Good afternoon. I'm here to talk to you about, I guess, probably one of the, well, unlike in the IT world, and unlike in librarianship, oftentimes archivists, when they're starting their career, find themselves in rather small organizations, or even working, as they're known sometimes, the Lone Ranger. Just out of curiosity, how many people here are in the archival path within this program? Well, we've got a couple anyways. My experience goes back to about 1984, when I started working in the profession, and it's included working in environments with as few as one person to as many as 177 people. And despite the fact that these are all very different sized organizations, many of the qualities that we look for, many of the qualities that were essential, I think, to working within that environment were consistent. But let me start first, I think, with the second question that we were asked to consider this afternoon, and that's how you pursue a career in archives. Once you get out of here, once you graduate, once you've fled the University of Toronto, obviously you're going to be expecting some return on the investment that you've made the last couple of years. And oftentimes, I remember when I got into working in archives, it was the early 1980s, it was a time of significant financial recession, and there were just no jobs around. And what was really necessary was to start with networking within that community. Fortunately, at the Faculty of Information, you do have a local chapter of the Association of Canadian Archivists. You do have the opportunity to work with the Toronto Area Archivist Group. You have the opportunity to volunteer with the Doors Open program and the open house at the City of Toronto Archives. And by getting involved in these organizations, becoming engaged, and engagement is certainly one of the buzzwords that's being heard more and more these days, not only within the information management profession, but especially at York University where I work, and meeting the people who will be doing the hiring, working with them, becoming recognized as a volunteer and somebody who's indeed committed to that profession, because through that volunteer engagement can often lead contracts. And contracts are a great way to get your foot in the door and to become known. And in my position, my first permanent job started at the Toronto Harbour Commission on a 6-month government works program. And on the last day of my works program, my boss turned to me and said, "Well, show up to work on Monday, you're hired." No formal interview. It was trial by battle, and I suppose I survived that experience. Many years later, I guess in around the middle of the last decade, around 2005, there was an individual who had worked as a steeplejack and was really interested in archives. And in addition to taking the courses at George Brown College, then volunteered his services at the Toronto Port Authority, which was the successor to the Toronto Harbour Commission. And through a series of interviews that he thought were security clearances, he ended up getting hired as the records administrator, and now is also their archivist. So issues of serendipity, issues of being in the right place at the right time, still occur and can still lead to full-time permanent employment. But you have to get yourself out there and make yourself known to the people who are doing the hiring. As was mentioned by Michael Ridley, knowing something about the organization that you want to work for is quite important. I have to be honest and admit that if I had received a letter working at Canadian Tire and the applicant had made frequent reference to Home Depot, I would think, now, do I really want this person doing archival description? One of what you always see in the job call for archivists, keen attention to detail. And if it's somebody else's name who appears at the top of the letter, Instead of Dear Michael, it might be somebody else, obviously from a previous application. Then I will think less about interviewing that person than somebody who's taken the time to get to know the organization that they're applying for. And even coming and visiting the organization where they want to work, making an appointment to be shown around and to discuss employment opportunities shows your interest and shows your commitment and can often make a difference in terms of getting your foot into the door. So moving on then, having established a relationship with a potential employer, how do you then, or what will the employer be looking for? Well, in my position, I do look for a solid grounding in theory, particularly in issues around appraisal, arrangement, and description. Many archival programs are quite small. In organizations like the Toronto Port Authority, there's only one person doing archival practices. When that person is being hired, they have to have some basis of knowing what they're doing. On the other hand, and I often think that this is one of the benefits of graduate education in this field, is knowing how to ask the right questions to find out what you need to know. And also knowing the people who you need to ask once you've taken on those responsibilities. It's also important in that environment to show an awareness of issues associated with reference services, with outreach, and especially digital initiatives these days, including the use of social media, whether it be Twitter or Facebook, looking at some of the work that the Library of Congress has done, for instance, on Facebook, where historical photographs become the portal for community engagement as various viewers of the images add their own comments, some useful, some not particularly useful, but quite funny, to these archival images. And also being able to work in the digital environment through the creation of digital exhibits. Certainly within the federal sector, when monies are being made available to archives to hire contract staff, it's for the creation of digital content and specifically for exhibits. They're not interested in seeing finding aids or catalogs being digitized. They're not interested in seeing entire batches of records being digitized. What they're looking for is the preparation of content that has been interpreted, that has been curated within that environment. And so having some experience in that way, even if it is something that you've done as a result of a course assignment, even if it's something that you've done on your own for a volunteer heritage organization, gives you a practical demonstration of your knowledge and your abilities in those areas and can be quite useful. Flexibility is certainly important. I remember talking to the archivist at the Marine Museum of Upper Canada. I mentioned that cleaning washrooms were part of her job description. It's important to realize, I think, that as you enter the workforce, archival positions sometimes evolve into somewhat unexpected duties and take you in different directions. You often end up having to work with a wide variety of professions, whether they be surveyors or engineers or IT professionals or librarians. Being able to develop a relationship amongst those professions and to understand their language and to speak their language is often critically important in the success of your projects and will be looked for by an employer. An appreciation for project management also comes in very useful. Clear identification of objectives, the identification of risks associated not only with action, but also inaction, and especially your ability to communicate. And I really cannot emphasize strongly enough the importance of good communication skills, and also good interpersonal skills, or the ability to engage with others, especially during the interview. You have basically 40 minutes, 30 minutes sometimes, to make a connection with a potential employer. I often find it somewhat ironic that when I interviewed for my position at York University, it was a day-long interview. In fact, the formal interview session took 2.5 hours. Whereas my interview for a position at the City of Toronto for Director of Corporate Record Systems and City Archivist, a position that initially looked after 120 positions with a budget of slightly over $10 million, that interview lasted 45 minutes. Now, there seems to be an inequality here in terms of the process. But at the end of the day, from the point of view of the city executives who are interviewing, if you cannot project a sense of yourself quickly and effectively then you're not going to have a chance to do it in the long run either. Often working in archives, you'll find yourself working not only with your colleagues, but also with the public, and with donors, and with volunteer boards, and with researchers who think that everything can be digitized for next to nothing. And so one of the things that an employer will be attempting to gauge is your ability to manage expectations, and to be able to communicate clearly why everything has not yet been scanned, why all of your finding aids are not yet in a full-text searchable database, to explain to donors why the gift that their family has held on to for 100 years is not worth $600,000, but only $6,000. And it's that ability to communicate and to manage those expectations that I think employers will be looking for through the interview process and also through probationary periods. And lastly, I would reinforce Michael's point that what I look for is a curious mind. That to me was always what archives were about. Usually in archives, or I should say it's very seldom in archives, that you get to work in the subject area in which you trained as an undergraduate. In my education was in history, specifically in Scottish history. Despite my best attempts to convince others that I should be acquiring Scottish books and manuscripts for York University, I realize it's a much better fit at Guelph. And therefore I now have to learn about dance, and I have to learn about art, and I have to learn about English literature written in Canada. I need to know about social reform and labor history. These were all areas that I studied perhaps on a very peripheral level when I was an undergraduate, but now lie at the core of my responsibilities. And our donors and our researchers expect me to be knowledgeable in this area. And so what I will look for in a prospective employee is somebody who shows curiosity about working at York University, has taken the time to find out which phone we have within our holdings, what our acquisition policy is, what kind of reference services we provide. And by showing that interest and that commitment, I recognize that person as someone who's curious, not only about working here, but likely will be able to project that curiosity into other subject areas as the need arises. And then I think a willingness for long-term development within the profession is also quite important. The willingness to become involved in professional organizations, but also to continuously learn, and some idea as to how you're going to be doing that is sought by potential employers. I would say in conclusion that having worked in this business for almost 30 years now, hardly 2 days have been the same. And it continues to challenge me on a regular basis. And has continued to be stimulating. So I would hardly recommend it as a career. It does require you to keep your wits about you, but at the end of the day, you truly are, I think, making a contribution to society in terms of preserving our collective memory.